The White Boats at Fairhaven. When Adrian Vale came to Fairhaven in the first week of August, he meant to stay only one afternoon. He had taken the coastal train north because the city had become unbearable, and because, at 40, a man may still call retreat a change of air if he speaks of it briskly enough. For months he had lived in a furnished apartment, facing a brick wall and a web of fire escapes. He had written little, answered fewer letters, and acquired the habit of going out each morning as though upon urgent business, only to discover, once he reached the street, that he had nowhere to go. His friends recommended rest, sea air, travel, practical work, and, in one particularly cheerful case, marriage. Adrian thanked them all and did nothing. Then, one morning, he found in an old guidebook a faded photograph of a harbor he did not know. Beneath it were the words, "Fairhaven, a summer anchorage." There were white boats upon still water, and pale houses looking down from a slope of trees. The picture had no grandeur, no wildness, no claim to inspire adventure. It suggested instead light, order, and room to breathe. By noon, he had bought a ticket. The train left him at a small station bright with geraniums. A road descended between hedges and old stone walls, and at the bottom of the hill he stopped short. Below him lay the harbor. 2 stone piers held a basin of quiet blue water. Inside them, yachts, launches, catboats, fishing skiffs, and 2 old cutters rode gently at their moorings. White hulls flashed in the sun. Masts stood in clear lines against the pale sky. Along the western quay, a few boys sat with their legs over the edge, talking and doing nothing. On the eastern side stood weathered gray boathouses with green doors and polished brass fittings. Beyond, on the curve of the shore, old houses with verandas, striped awnings, and steps leading almost to the water rose among elms and pines. No sound reached him at first but the tapping of halyards and the cry of gulls. It was not silence. It was merely a better-made kind of noise. He found the inn without asking. It stood opposite the harbor behind a wide veranda shaded by striped canvas. The sign read, "The Anchor House." The landlady, Mrs. Elliston, a brisk widow with silver hair and the manner of one who governs guests so well that they mistake it for freedom, told him she had 1 room left at the top of the house, overlooking the harbor. He took it before seeing it. When he did see it, he felt for the first time in weeks an unreasonable gratitude. The room was small, cool, and old-fashioned, with a narrow bed, a writing table by the window, and curtains that stirred in the sea air. Below him, the harbor shone white and blue. "You are staying a week?" Mrs. Elliston asked. 2 days, said Adrian. Mrs. Elliston entered a week in her book without comment. He unpacked just enough to feel less transient, washed, and went down again. The afternoon had mellowed. There was a smell of warm rope, tar, flowers from the square, and salt drying on sun-warmed stones. He crossed to the quay and walked along it with the aimless purpose of a man who wishes to belong at once to a place and yet be noticed by no one. He paused beside a graceful auxiliary schooner painted cream white, with a dark green stripe and varnished spars so beautifully finished that the late sunlight seemed to run along them. At the stern, her name stood in gold, Maribel. "She makes the rest look as if they had only come to apologize," said a voice behind him. He turned. A woman stood there with a coil of light rope over one arm and a boating cap in her hand. She was dressed for use rather than display, in a white shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly above the wrists, a navy skirt, and sensible deck shoes. Her hair had freed itself in places from whatever discipline had earlier been applied to it. Her expression was composed, but her eyes held humor. "I was thinking much the same thing," Adrian said. "She belongs to Captain Niall Mercer," the woman said. "He believes in polished brass, exact clocks, and the moral superiority of sail over everything that does not own it." "That sounds severe." "It is merely accurate." She smiled, stepped aboard the yacht, laid down the rope and looked back at him. "My name is Adrian Vale," he said. "Clara Mercer." He repeated the name inwardly. "You are visiting?" she asked. "I arrived an hour ago." "And already you have chosen the proper place to stand. That is encouraging." "I have also chosen the inn." "Then by tomorrow you will know everyone's business, and by the end of the week they will all know yours. Fairhaven is small, but efficient." "There is very little of mine worth knowing." She regarded him briefly. "People say that when they wish either to be contradicted or left alone," she said. "Which do you prefer?" "Today? Left alone by most people. Contradicted by one or two." "That is manageable. If you walk farther down the quay, there is a bench beneath the signal mast where one may watch the whole harbor without being obliged to speak. If you stay here, my father will presently return and explain the history of every yacht at a length that would make repentance brief." "I am much in your debt." "You may repay it by pretending not to notice that I have rescued you." She nodded and went toward the boathouse. Adrian obeyed her advice and sat under the signal mast until sunset. The harbor softened by degrees. White boats turned rose, then pearl. Windows lit in the houses above the shore. At last, the water, which had all day reflected the sky, began to seem the deeper thing. From the bench he could see Maribel clearly. Clara came and went on deck several times, once with folded charts, once merely to stand at the rail and speak to an older man whom Adrian took to be Captain Mercer. There was between them the easy understanding of people long accustomed to each other. At dinner, Mrs. Elliston seated him opposite a retired judge who returned every July for the apricot tart and sea air, and next to Miss Beatrice Lorne, who painted watercolors of boats and admitted freely that once finished, all of them looked alike. It was Miss Lorne who mentioned Clara Mercer first. "You have seen the Mercers, of course," she said, as if no newcomer could have failed in the duty. "I believe I spoke with Miss Mercer on the quay." "Then the place has introduced itself properly. She knows everybody, manages half the regatta committee, can steer better than most of the men, and has been refusing excellent proposals for years with such kindness that the rejected feel almost complimented." "Beatrice," said the judge mildly, "you describe a woman as if she were a racing yacht." "And why not? Fairhaven understands yachts better than women." Mrs. Elliston then asked Adrian whether he wrote for newspapers. Apparently his face had struck her as either literary or underfed. "For magazines sometimes," said Adrian. It displeased him to say it. He had once been reviewed more often than he was now invited. Yet it was not wholly false. "What sort of things?" asked Miss Lorne. "Fiction." "Then you must meet Captain Mercer," she declared. "He distrusts fiction, and therefore naturally supplies enough of it for the whole harbor." The table laughed. Adrian smiled too, but Clara's name stayed with him. The next morning dawned clear, with a light wind and a whiteness in the sky that promised heat later. Adrian attempted an hour of work and produced nothing worth keeping. He went out early to the eastern pier and found Clara speaking with a man in oilskins. When she saw him, she came over. "You survived dinner," she said. "Barely. I was examined, classified, and placed under observation." "That means you are accepted for the present." "And if I fail to maintain the standard?" "You will be pitied." Fairhaven is merciful to transients. She glanced toward the water. Can you sail? Badly. That is hopeful. Those who say perfectly are usually disasters. We are taking Maribel across the bay after luncheon. My father needs an extra pair of hands and does not admit it. If you are idle, you may come. Is this charity? This is practical need decorated to spare your pride. Then I accept with gratitude. Good. Wear something that will forgive salt water. At 2 o'clock, the harbor had brightened into full summer splendor. Adrian, in old duck trousers and a blue sweater borrowed from the innkeeper's son, found Captain Mercer already aboard Maribel. The captain was tall, weather-browned, with a clipped gray beard and the unmistakable air of one long accustomed to giving orders where delay was dangerous. Yet his eyes were frank and almost youthful. "Mr. Vale," he said after Clara had introduced them, "my daughter tells me you can be trusted to admit ignorance. That is the first qualification for decent seamanship. I hope to acquire the second before evening. The second is obedience. You may yet." They cast off with little ceremony. Once clear of the piers, the sail was hoisted, the engine silenced, and the yacht changed from a machine into something living. They stood out through the harbor mouth into the broader blue beyond. Low islands, tufted with pines and ringed with rock, lay to seaward. Behind them, Fairhaven receded into a picture of clustered masts, white houses, and red roofs. To Adrian, who had not been on the water in years, the sensation was not excitement, but release. Something in him, long cramped by walls, clocks, and the exhausted movements of city life, seemed to expand to the measure of the horizon. He obeyed orders, learned quickly, and had the rare happiness of being useful without pretending competence. Captain Mercer proved exact without pedantry. Clara moved about the deck with the grace that comes only of habit and affection for the thing one handles. Once, when Adrian fumbled the sheet, she said quietly, "Not against it. Feel where the rope wants to run." He remembered the instruction later, far beyond its nautical use. They anchored in a cove where the water was green over white sand and drank coffee from a silver thermos while Maribel rode lazily at her chain. Captain Mercer spoke little at first, but after the second cup he thought enough to mention books. "I distrust novels," he said, looking at Adrian over the rim of the cup, "because they pretend life can be arranged. At sea one learns otherwise. Yet people continue to read them. People continue to do many foolish things. Still," he glanced toward Clara, leaning over the rail with her fingers in the water, "they are not always wrong to want shape, even when they cannot get truth." Clara looked back. "That is the nearest he comes to approving fiction." "It is the nearest fiction comes to deserving approval," said the captain. The words struck Adrian harder than praise would have done. Once he had believed his work was precisely that, to give shape where life gave confusion. Lately he had suspected he had done little more than arrange surfaces. They returned to Fairhaven under a softer light. Boys shouted from the pier. Miss Lorne lifted her parasol in salute. Mrs. Elliston sat on the veranda of the inn like a benevolent customs officer of civilization itself. So began his stay. 2 days became 5, then 10. Mrs. Elliston quietly shifted his charge from weekly to fortnightly. Adrian developed habits: coffee on the veranda, an hour of attempted writing, a walk to the quay, afternoons on the water if invited, or in the village if not, evenings either at the inn or on the Mercer's veranda overlooking the western side of the harbor. He learned Fairhaven chiefly through Clara. She showed him the old chandlery where a bell from a wrecked brig hung above the door, the lane of fishermen's cottages beyond the east hill, the abandoned tide mill half hidden in reeds, and the path to Beacon Point from which the whole harbor could be seen in one sweep. She knew not only places, but the histories attached to them. Which house had once belonged to a composer who never composed there? Which boat had carried 3 generations of stubborn men? Which widow grew the best roses and the worst opinions? It was impossible to spend long in her company without feeling that she inhabited the world fully, neither defensively nor sentimentally. She saw absurdity quickly, but did not live by it. She had humor without contempt. Adrian, who had spent too many years among clever people for whom irony was a permanent climate, found her directness first refreshing, and then, before he dared confess it, necessary. He loved her gradually and all at once. Not because of one scene alone, though there were many. The afternoon she steered Maribel through choppy water, with rain in her hair and delight in her eyes. The evening she read aloud on the Mercer veranda from a ridiculous travel memoir, until even her father laughed. The morning he found her bargaining with a fisherman for 2 scarlet snapper, and winning by praising his wife's dahlias. All of it mattered. Yet there was also an ordinary day, sunny and windless, when he watched her leaning from the pier to untie a skiff, and knew with unbearable simplicity that no future from which she was absent would ever again seem to him acceptable. The difficulty lay partly in himself. Adrian had not come to Fairhaven inwardly free. There were no scandalous entanglements, but there was fatigue, failure, and that erosion of confidence by which a man begins to distrust even the honorable motions of his own heart. He had made enough beginnings to fear another. He knew, too, that he did not belong to Fairhaven as Clara did. He was a visitor with uncertain means, a writer whose name, if remembered at all, belonged more to yesterday than to today. As for Clara, he could not read her beyond a point. She gave him friendship freely, sought his company naturally, and trusted him with the best of her conversation. Yet she retained that inward balance which keeps certain women from ever appearing to lean. There were moments when he believed she cared for him more deeply. Then an hour later, she would speak with such unaffected calm that he suspected he had been composing inferences like a novelist again. Fairhaven, being small, naturally took an interest. Not openly. A town of good breeding does not interrogate where it can merely observe. Still, Adrian noticed how often chairs were left side by side for him and Clara, how Miss Lorne discovered urgent reasons to depart early when the Mercers had invited him to supper, how Mrs. Elliston watched him over the coffee urn like one following a serial in monthly numbers. It was Captain Mercer who altered the situation. One afternoon, Adrian found him alone in the boathouse oiling blocks. The open doors framed the harbor in quiet blue and white. "How long do you mean to stay?" the captain asked. "I don't know." That is an answer suitable to weather, not to men. Adrian said nothing. "I am not meddling for sport," said Captain Mercer. "If my daughter were a silly girl, I should leave her to silly consequences. She is not. Nor, I think, are you. But there is a kind of drifting which, on land, does more damage than a storm." Color rose to Adrian's face. "I would sooner hurt myself than her." "That is often the beginning of the trouble," said the captain. "A man delays, hesitates, waits to be certain of things no one is ever certain of, and meanwhile, a woman is expected to understand fog as if it were a map." "You think I am in a fog?" "I think you have been in one long enough to mistake it for climate." The words, though severe, held no hostility. Adrian took a breath. "If I spoke and were refused, I could bear it. What I cannot bear is asking her to trust a man who has not lately trusted himself." Captain Mercer's expression softened a little. "Then begin by doing one honorable thing. Tell her the truth of yourself. Not a speech. The truth. Women are not made safer by being handled like porcelain." He returned to his work, dismissing the matter. Adrian went out into the sun with the uncomfortable feeling that he had just been ordered into adulthood. Yet he delayed 3 more days. They were lovely days, which made delay easier and, therefore, more shameful. The regatta filled the harbor with visiting craft. There were races, lunches, speeches too long for the heat, children trailing little flags, and a dance that evening on the hotel veranda. Adrian moved through it all with Clara often beside him. Several times he nearly spoke. Each time some noise, interruption, or cowardly sense that another occasion would be finer intervened. The occasion came the next evening almost by force. A sudden squall had blown in from the southeast just before sunset. Several small boats dragged at their moorings. Maribel, properly secured, rode it out nobly. By the time the rain passed, the harbor had become silver and still. The sky cleared first in the west, and the pale gold light spread over the water. Adrian went down to the quay partly from habit, partly because, after weather, one wishes to assure oneself that the world remains. The piers were wet and smelled richly of stone and weed. Reflections doubled the masts in quiet, trembling lines. At the far end of the eastern pier, Clara stood alone, looking outward. He walked to her, and for a moment neither spoke. "Fair haven after rain," she said at last. "Always looks as if it had forgiven everybody." "That is fortunate," Adrian said. "I have need of forgiveness." She turned to him. The humor went out of her face, not into fear, but into attention. "Clara," he said, then stopped. All the speeches he might once have written for another man in such a moment seemed suddenly false coin. Captain Mercer's instruction returned to him. Not a speech. The truth. "I ought to have spoken sooner," he said. "I delayed because I was uncertain of myself, and because I wanted, selfishly, to go on seeing you without risking that. But uncertainty is no respect to you. It is only cowardice with good manners. When I came here, I had made a poor business of my own life. I had fallen into one of those states in which a man thinks he is merely tired, when in fact he has begun to abandon himself. Fairhaven gave me air. Your father gave me orders. And you, without knowing it, gave me back the desire to be answerable for what I say and do. I love you. I have loved you longer than I admitted even to myself. I cannot offer you certainty except in that. I do not know exactly what my work or future will become, but I know that without you, every plan seems once again like postponement. If there is any hope for me, it is with you." He had not taken her hand. He stood as if before judgment. Clara looked at him steadily. The harbor behind her held all its white boats in a luminous hush. "Do you know," she said quietly, "that I have been waiting so long for you to say that. I had nearly begun to despise myself for hoping." Adrian stared at her. "I thought at first you were merely another visitor, dazzled by weather and boats. Then I thought you troubled. Then I thought you perhaps cared, but had made a religion of doubt. That was the stage at which I came nearest to anger." She stepped closer. "My father said yesterday that if you did not speak soon, he would throw you bodily into the harbor for refreshment." Adrian laughed, but the laugh broke. "Then I owe him everything." "You owe him less than you owe yourself for finally being honest." "And you?" he asked. She answered first by giving him the hand he had not dared to take. "As for me," she said, and now the smile stayed, "I love you too. There, it was not impossible." He drew her toward him then, and the world, which had lately seemed so ill-arranged, aligned itself in the simplest form. The wet pier underfoot, the rain-washed harbor before them, and Clara in his arms. News, naturally, traveled. By breakfast next morning, Mrs. Elliston had somehow become aware of everything while preserving the fiction that she knew nothing. Miss Lorne embraced Clara in the square, and Adrian on the hotel steps with equal lack of restraint. The retired judge observed that it was always a comfort when people ceased arguing with the obvious. Captain Mercer shook Adrian's hand with a grip that contained approval, relief, and a warning not to behave like a fool hereafter. What followed was not instantaneous bliss, but the practical beginning of a shared life, which is better. Adrian returned to the city only long enough to settle his affairs, give up the dismal apartment, and recover the manuscripts he had abandoned to dust and contempt. He found, to his surprise, that work came more readily once life no longer depended on his wringing all meaning from it alone. He rode in Fairhaven through autumn, at a room over the old chandlery lent him by Captain Mercer, who maintained that if one intended to marry his daughter, one might as well earn part of the privilege in view of the tide. By spring, Adrian and Clara were married quietly at St. Luke's, with gulls crying above the churchyard and the harbor shining beyond the last houses. Mrs. Elliston supplied the wedding breakfast and wept over the coffee cups with such discipline that no tear fell where it should not. Captain Mercer performed his paternal duties as if supervising a maneuver under changing wind. Miss Lorne painted the scene afterward and made the church too pink and Adrian much handsomer. But as everyone said, that is what art is for. In June they took the cottage on Beacon Lane, a gray-shingled house with climbing roses, a narrow lawn, and windows from which the harbor could be seen between two pines. It was not large. Its floors sloped with old age. The kitchen had an opinionated stove, and in high wind the front gate talked at night. Clara loved it from the first. Adrian loved it because she did, and because every room she inhabited seemed to gain the final proportion it had previously lacked. Years later, when visitors asked what had first brought him to Fairhaven, Adrian used to answer lightly that he had come for the sea air, and stayed because the town practiced excellent navigation of lost souls. But privately he knew better. He had been saved not by applause, nor by some violent revelation, and not even by recovered success, though work had indeed returned. He had been saved by white boats on still water, by a harbor arranged under summer light, with such modest sanity that a tired man could trust it at once, by the plain speech of an old sailor, and above all, by a woman who knew the difference between hesitation and feeling, and had the courage to wait just long enough for one to declare itself against the other. On certain evenings at the end of summer, when the sun lowered over the western pier and turned all the anchored yachts pale gold, Adrian would stand with Clara on their little lawn and watch the harbor settle into luminous rest. The masts darkened delicately against the afterglow. Someone on a launch laughed across the water. From the anchor house veranda, a piano, not always in tune and never ashamed of it, might begin a waltz. Then Clara, slipping her arm through his, would say, "Look, the boats are pretending they have always belonged to the light." And Adrian, who knew better, would answer, "So have we."